Hello, and welcome to lecture 8.2 of Mystery and Reason. We started our philosophy unit in lecture 8.1, and I gave you my introduction, or one way of introducing the topic. And I thought I would give you another general introduction to philosophy, this time focused on the article I had you read by Eric Schwitzgebel called The Penumbral Plunge. So we'll talk about the ideas he gives us in that article, including these topics here. But let's start. Maybe we'll start in the same place that we did in the last lecture. I love this quotation from the ancient Greek philosopher Plato, probably the most famous philosopher of all time in the Western world. Um, he apparently said that wonder is the only beginning of philosophy. And we talked a lot about wonder in the very first lecture, 1.1, as well as in the previous one, 8.1. And in a way, we'll continue with that theme, since after all, wonder is sort of the connecting idea between mystery and philosophy. Okay. And that's what I was trying to explain way back in lecture 1.1. But let's move on and focus on philosophy specifically. And one question that I think it might be worth starting with, especially since we were just looking at a quotation from ancient Greece, which was over 2,000 years ago, it's common to hear people criticize philosophy for not having made any real progress after over 2 millennia of thinking, writing, and debating. So that's a commonly heard complaint or criticism or dismissal of the entire project of philosophy, that it hasn't made any progress. Therefore, whatever, we should stop doing it. It's, misguided. We should do something else instead, like science or who knows what. Okay, so that's a common complaint, a common criticism. After all, philosophers today are indeed still asking and still trying to answer the very same questions that were asked by ancient philosophers like Plato. For instance, what is justice? Or can we know anything with certainty? Okay. Or what is the best way of living a human life? These are questions that have been with us for a very long time. They're still with us, and part of the point of this lecture is to explain the importance of such questions, but also what makes them distinct or distinctive, what makes them different from other types of questions. Okay. So how do we respond to this criticism? Well, one way would be sort of a direct response. Some people try to say, you know what, actually, philosophy has made some progress. And they try to give some examples, but it's kind of hard to come up with good, convincing examples. Some of the ones that are offered are logic. So, logic, as I explained last time, is one of the subfields of philosophy. We talked a little bit about it when we first were distinguishing between deductive and inductive arguments and the concept of a valid argument. That belongs to the study of logic. Logic was first really started back in ancient Greece with Aristotle, who was Plato's student. He's thought of as the first person who really developed some form of logic. But then the rise of modern logic, which really came in the late 19th century, the late 1800s, with the German philosopher Frege and other people after him, and the connections of between modern logic and mathematics, as well as computer science. This is often given as an example of progress in philosophy, that we had Aristotle's logic for a really long time, and then Frege and Bertrand Russell and Wittgenstein and other people came along, and they made significant progress in logic. Okay, so maybe that's one place in which philosophy has made progress. Another major example would be from the philosopher Descartes, René Descartes, a French philosopher from the 17th century, 1600s. He is thought of as the first modern philosopher in the Western tradition. Modern is a tricky word. It can mean lots of things, but usually we say modern philosophy in the West begins with Descartes. Sometimes that's called early modern philosophy. Anyway, the reason why he was so significant is because now let me use some words that I taught you in the last lecture. He took a strategy of doing metaphysics by means of epistemology. Okay, let's decode that. Metaphysics is the study of reality, of existence, of the fundamental structure of reality, the basic types of beings or modes of being that exist. So that's metaphysics. And that's what a lot of philosophers had been focused on for a long time, starting with Plato or even people before Plato, the pre-Socratic philosophers, but certainly the entire period of scholastic philosophy, which had close associations with Christian theology, but they were very much focused on metaphysics, of trying to give a systematic doctrine of the structure of reality as a whole. And Descartes said, you know what? Maybe we should start, before we get to metaphysics, we should start with epistemology, which is the study of knowledge, of what we can know, of what we can know with certainty, as opposed to merely believe or have a sort of a high probability of being true. He wanted to know if we can get absolute certainty about anything. And he thought that first we have to figure that out before we try to make claims about the nature of reality that are supposed to be absolutely certain, right? We need to know what knowledge is and what we're capable of knowing. Are we even capable of doing metaphysics? Or are we fundamentally limited and we can't access the fundamental structure of reality? That's a theme that got taken up by philosophers like Kant, who I told you about way back in lecture 1.1. He came about 100, 150 years after Descartes. But this whole period of early modern philosophy, where it's sometimes called the epistemic turn or the epistemological turn, it's like a turn in the road in the history of philosophy, where instead of just trying to say what exists and what it's like, we first focus on ourselves and what we can know, and only then can we say what exists and what it's like with confidence or with certainty. Okay. So this is thought to be a step in the right direction that, we think that Descartes made significant progress by this move. To be more specific, Descartes thought that we can only answer the questions of metaphysics, for example, questions about the nature of reality, of whether God exists, of whether we have an immaterial soul, something that's non-physical about us. These sorts of questions typically are thought to belong to metaphysics, and he thinks we can only answer these if we begin with epistemology, the study of what we can know, because maybe we can't know these things, or maybe by looking at what we're capable of knowing, we'll see that the starting point for metaphysics should be different from what people used to think. And that's what really happened, because he begins his philosophy with the epistemological claim that the only thing one can know with certainty is one's own existence. Or as he famously put it, I think, therefore I am. He thinks the one thing we can know the existence of with certainty is ourself, is myself, or if you're thinking about it, it's yourself, right? He thinks that everything else could be an illusion. The entire world around you, everything beyond, your present conscious state could be non-existent or could be very different from how you perceive it, and so you don't know any of that stuff with certainty, but you've got to know that you exist, because there can't even be an illusion if there's not somebody to be subject to that illusion, right? You can't say, oh, maybe my existence is an illusion. It's like, well, who is experiencing that illusion? What do you mean so the illusion exists, but you don't? But the illusion has to be something that is in the consciousness of a conscious being, and so that conscious being has to exist, even if it's wrong about everything. It's got to exist. And so the one thing it can be right about with certainty is that it exists. Okay. And he thinks the main way of existing as the kind of things that we are is thinking, or you could say being conscious. But he thought of consciousness and thought as roughly synonymous. Anyway, so that's sometimes thought of as a clear case of progress in philosophy. But these are, cherry-picked examples in a way, and it's hard to come up with a lot of good examples. And so maybe this isn't the right way to respond to the criticism that philosophy doesn't make any progress. So there's another more indirect way of responding to the criticism that philosophy has made no progress. And what that is we can target certain assumptions that are likely built into the criticism. And this is something philosophers often do. Instead of directly, disagreeing with somebody, we look at things that they are, instead of disagreeing with their conclusion, we look at their premises, right? We look at what they're supporting their conclusion with, and we say, you're assuming these premises, but how do we know those are true, right? And so we often will reorient the debate and target somebody's premises or the premises of the premises and so on, right? And so the assumptions that are built into this idea that philosophy hasn't made any progress would be assumptions about the nature of philosophical questions, first of all. Also, assumptions about what kinds of answers these questions can have, and assumptions about what progress in philosophy looks like. So, questions, answers, and the possibility of progress, we have a tendency to think we know what that is like for philosophy, like questions and answers. Everybody knows what those are, but there's different kinds of questions. And if you have a different kind of question, you might get a different kind of answer. And it might not be the kind of answer that a more familiar type of question might have. And making progress in answering questions might also look very different if the types of questions are very different. So that's what we're going to be focusing on here. Because it turns out the critic is misunderstanding the nature of philosophy. So I say if, sorry, if it turns out, I think it is true, but let's be modest here. If it turns out that the critic of philosophy is misunderstanding one of these things, then perhaps they're holding philosophy to standards that are not appropriate to it, right? So if they think, oh, philosophy should be just like science, well, then they're going to be holding it to the standards of science. And if it doesn't meet those standards, they're going to say philosophy is a failure. But what if that's not what it's trying to do? It's not trying to do the same thing as science, so you shouldn't judge it by the same standards, right? For example, okay, this is what I just said, but I'll be more specific. They might be holding philosophy to standards that are only appropriate to natural or physical science, where most questions are about physical phenomena that can be tested through empirical observations or experiments. There should be a period there. By contrast, it's pretty clear that there's not going to be an empirical or an experimental way to test claims like God exists, or we have immaterial souls, or we are morally obligated to help one another, or the meaning of life is something everyone must define for themselves, etc. Right? These are not things that we can test by doing an experiment where we can observe certain, phenomena, record data, and draw our conclusions following a kind of scientific method. That's just not going to work for these sorts of questions. They are sort of beyond the reach of physical science in a way, right? If you're skeptical of that response, and you think, well, what do you mean they're beyond the reach of science? If we're talking about non-physical things, we're probably talking about things that just don't exist, or we have no way of knowing whether they exist. So it's pointless to try to, make an argument to support these claims. We're just not going to be able to do it. The only thing we can really know is the physical world. But that also has assumptions built into it. That's assuming that the only thing we can know is the physical world, and in order to justify that claim, guess what? You have to stop doing physical science and start doing think something like epistemology, right? To make a claim about what can be known. And if you're doing epistemology, well, then you're doing philosophy. But I thought you were trying to criticize philosophy. So that's the kind of response I often give to what's known as scientism. I didn't put that word in here, but it belongs. Scientism is what is the assumption that physical science or natural science is really the only way of achieving, real solid knowledge of anything. And anything other than natural science is sort of less certain, or less, it doesn't count as knowledge in to the same degree as scientific knowledge does. And scientism is going to be the kind of uh, worldview or ideology that thinks everything should be held to all forms of knowledge should be held to the same standards, and science does the best at meeting those standards. Philosophy does much worse, and so philosophy can either be disregarded or, ignored or whatever. Okay. So if you didn't already figure it out, I'm very much against scientism, and I think most philosophers are, but that's not, but there are a lot of philosophers who sort of see what they're doing as subservient to the sciences, like we're just clarifying some of the concepts that science uses. That's one way that people do philosophy, but I think for most philosophers, especially throughout history, they did not think that natural science was the highest form of knowledge. But a lot of people in the modern world do think that, and so it's something that we have to deal with as philosophers. We have to respond to these kinds of criticisms. Okay. All right, let's get to Schwitzgebel. And the article he wrote is going to be really belong to the field of metaphilosophy. That's a subfield of philosophy. I think I mentioned it in the last lecture. Maybe I think it was the last one, the last subfield that I mentioned. Metaphilosophy is the study of philosophy itself. Okay, that's what we're doing, right? We're trying to say what philosophy is, what philosophical questions are like, whether we can achieve knowledge in philosophy, whether we can make progress, how philosophy is different from science, and so on. So we're doing meta philosophy right now. Um, and Eric Schwitzgebel, he's a professor at UCR, University of California, Riverside, just however many 60 miles from here, from Laguna Beach, maybe. Anyway, I was at grad school at UCR, and I never took a class with him actually, but I was a TA for him at one point. But anyway, he's still there, even though I'm not. His areas of interest include the philosophy of psychology, the philosophy of mind, moral psychology, classical Chinese philosophy, epistemology, metaphilosophy, that's what we're going to be looking at, metaphysics, science fiction, and other things. You can check out his. Actually, the best way to look him up probably is his blog. So since 2006, he has run the blog called The Splintered Mind. Here's the link to that. He's written many books as well, called The Perplexities of Consciousness, A Theory of Jerks and Other Philosophical Misadventures. So he has a analysis of what it means to be a jerk. And then his most recent book is called The Weirdness of the World. So he's a pretty, you know, he has a diverse set of interests. He is relatively famous as far as philosophers go. He's a pretty big deal, I guess. So anyway, we're looking at a recent article he wrote earlier this year, called "The Penumbral Plunge," in which he presents an interesting metaphor for thinking about the distinctive nature of philosophical questions. And he argues that philosophy is one of the things that makes human beings awesome. All right, well, that sounds nice. And honestly, this will be a pretty feel-good lecture. If you're skeptical of philosophy, there's going to be, I'll talk a little bit about, skepticism and doubting such claims, but he makes lots of very strong claims that he doesn't necessarily argue for, but he really does a good job at sort of rhetorically, persuading us at least to take philosophy more seriously than we might otherwise do, or maybe not. Maybe all of this will look like, navel gazing, idealistic fluff to you. But don't worry, we'll get to other approaches to philosophy as well. So this is a pretty optimistic way of thinking about philosophy, as you'll see, and about human life for what it's worth. Okay, so what is this title? You might not even understand the title, penumbral. What a weird word, right? So he's got this key metaphor which involves the contrast between light and darkness, and most importantly, the intermediate region between light and darkness, which is known as a penumbra. I think this term originally comes from astronomy, like the shadow that I don't know, that the Earth casts on the moon, and sometimes the moon is in the penumbra of the Earth, and it gets darker. I don't know. Anyway, but here's a very simple image. Here we have a circle of light, which he'll refer to. We have darkness out here, and then we have this penumbra, or this sort of half-shadowed region. The word comes from the Latin pine for almost and umbra for shadow. Maybe you've heard the word penultimate, which also has the prefix pen, meaning second to ultimate or second to last. Anyway, here's what he says about this metaphor. Within the circle of light lies what is straightforwardly knowable through common sense, mainstream science, or other established methods. Okay, so in a way he's talking about he's doing epistemology. He's talking about what kinds of things we can know and in what ways. If we can know something straightforwardly, whatever that means, well, if we can know it through common sense, whatever that means, mainstream science, okay, I think we know what that is, or other established methods. Okay, so this isn't super clear, but I think you get the idea. There's certain things that are straightforwardly knowable that are uncontroversial. I think I made a list of these in one of the early lectures on chapter 4 of Larry Wright's book. Anyway, that's what's within the circle of light. Okay. As the circle of light expands, so too does the ring of darkness around it. So this ring of darkness is the penumbra, and he's talking about how the circle of light expands because over time, as human beings, we learn more and more, both as individuals and as a species. So things that we know in a straightforward way expand. So the circle of light expands, and so there's less darkness and there's more light, but the ring around the circle of light, in a way, it gets bigger as the circle expands, right? So the more we know, the more things there are on the boundary of our knowledge. And he thinks philosophy lives in that ring of darkness or half darkness. More specifically, it lives in the penumbra, the shadowy boundary just beyond the light. And by the way, since this is not from a book with page numbers, I've decided to number the paragraphs in this article. So if you want to find some of these quotations, of course, you can just, search and copy and paste things, but I'll put paragraph numbers. Okay. So here are some examples of statements that lie within the circle of light. These are examples that he gives of things that are straightforwardly knowable. Water is H2O. There's tea in this mug. Confucius died more than 2,000 years ago. You shouldn't schedule children's parties at 3 in the morning. So that's a nice variety, right? We have a scientific statement, water is H2O from chemistry. We have a statement about ordinary, perception of objects around us. There's tea in the mug. We have a statement about ancient history. So that's, a little, you might think that's not as straightforwardly knowable, but again, it's just, we're not giving specific dates for Confucius. We're just saying more than 2,000 years ago. I think almost everybody would agree with that. And you shouldn't schedule children's parties. That's a normative claim about not about what is, but about what should be or how we should act. But again, it's a pretty uncontroversial normative claim. So these are things we could call straightforwardly knowable. That doesn't mean we know them with certainty. That doesn't mean that this is infallible knowledge. It's just relatively direct knowledge. It's just things that we can just, as soon as we read it, we're like, oh yeah, I'm pretty sure that's true, right? We don't have to think very hard about these things. Okay. And now here are some examples of statements that lie in the penumbra. In the penumbra are matters of conjecture or speculation. For instance, there's alien life somewhere in the galaxy. Human beings are essentially just arrangements of material stuff and nothing more. My retiring colleague will enjoy this Friedrich Nietzsche finger puppet I just gave her. Okay, so again, we've got a variety here. We've got a claim about what exists in the universe, whether there's alien life. We've got a claim about the nature of human beings. This is really a philosophical claim. The second one, that human beings are merely material and we don't have something like an immaterial soul or consciousness. And then this other one is a prediction about a person's reaction to a gift. Again, it's like, this is a very mundane thing, and of course it will become straightforwardly knowable once he gives her the finger puppet. But when he's, when you're shopping for a gift, you don't know how are they going to like this. I don't, I know them pretty well, but who knows? This might rub them the wrong way. They might not really care for these things. And so it's not straightforwardly knowable. We can say it belongs to the penumbra. Now, this distinction between the circle of light and the penumbra is a useful one, I think, but let's not forget that it's ultimately just a metaphor or an analogy, and it certainly doesn't fully capture the nature of philosophy and how it differs from other pursuits. It's really just a nice place to start. And he immediately makes some important qualifications, lest we take it too seriously. So, first of all, he makes it clear that there's no sharp line between light and dark. There's no sharp beginning or end to the penumbra. It's not like we can classify things as this is definitely in the penumbra and this is definitely not, right? So there's vague or blurry boundaries here. Also, he doesn't want you to completely equate philosophy and the penumbra. He says not all penumbral questions are philosophical, and philosophy doesn't dwell only in the penumbra. Okay. So, just to remind you, the penumbral questions, I didn't mention this part of the last quotation, they are questions where we have to make conjectures or speculations, right? A conjecture is like a hypothesis or an educated guess. It's often used in math when we don't know that a certain mathematical statement is true because we haven't proved it yet, but if we might have reason to think it's true, and so we call it a conjecture. Speculation, I think you know what that means. So, speculating about things often means we don't have, solid arguments for believing one thing or another, but we still think about different possibilities, different rival conclusions, even if we can't necessarily rank the rivals and so on, right? Okay. So yeah, so he makes those qualifications. So why are not all penumbral questions philosophical? Well, here's some examples. Was there, he gave some, but he gives some more. Was there once life on Mars? So another question about the universe, the wider universe, and about the distant past, right? We might not be able to answer that. Maybe we'll eventually, have the technology to do archaeological excavations on Mars where we can dig deep enough to find what was happening, millions of years ago, and maybe we'll find some fossils of living organisms. Maybe we'll never be able to do that. So this is a penumbral question. We can't answer it now, and it's not clear when we will be able to answer it. Will my colleague enjoy the Nietzsche finger puppet? It's not a philosophical. So yeah, so the first one is like a scientific question, not really a philosophical question. The second one is just an interpersonal, sort of thing. It's not a philosophical question, even if it's about a philosopher, right? Indirectly. How about this? When will the big one happen? And by that, I mean the big earthquake that people worry about. So the San Andreas Fault, I think it's this red line that runs through, yeah, like Palm Springs and Joshua Tree out there. I guess there's other pretty major fault lines closer to us, but luckily we're pretty far. I think this fault line here is above is past the Santa Ana Mountains, I think, or it's in them. Okay, so if there was a big one there, we might get hit. But anyway, predicting earthquakes is notoriously difficult, and we have some ways of doing it, but not. It's by no means a fully developed science, and so again, this is yeah, sort of a scientific question, but it's at the limits of what we can do, just like the first one. Is it possible to teleport a human being? Again, a scientific question, not a philosophical one, but we just don't know if we're ever going to have the technology to do something like this. We can teleport like individual atoms, I think. I've heard that, although I'm not sure how they know that it's like the same one. I don't think it is the same one. So yeah, what does it mean to teleport? That's a good question. There are philosophical problems that can arise when you start thinking about teleportation, like what happens if if because what somehow a teleporter has to like dissolve your matter and then on the other end it has to reconstitute you in exactly the same way. But what if the dissolving process doesn't happen, but the reconstituting does, and then there's two of you? Which one's the real you? Or so those are get into philosophical questions. Anyway, so these are penumbral questions, definitely not straightforwardly answerable, and they involve lots of conjecture and speculation. What about questions that are philosophical or at least belong to philosophy or are asked by philosophers rather than other people, but are not in the penumbra? So, logic, again, we used it as an example of a sort of clear progress in philosophy. Questions about logic are not penumbral. So if we have this question, if not P and not Q implies P, if those are both true, is Q necessarily true? In other words, is there a valid argument that goes from these two premises to this conclusion? I'll leave that as a extra credit question. If you email me an answer to that with an explanation, I'll give you some extra credit. Okay? But that's it. So it's not necessarily easy, but once you learn logic, it becomes easy. It's something that some people know how to straightforwardly answer. Okay, so I happen to know the answer to that. Maybe you already know it, but there's definitely a way you can learn the answer and it can become straightforward. So it doesn't require speculation or conjecture or anything like that, but it's part of logic, and logic is part of philosophy. So I guess this is an example of a philosophical question that's not penumbral, although it's sort of borderline philosophical. Logic is kind of halfway between philosophy and math in a way. And so it's not quite clear that this is a philosophical question, and that's why I say it's a question that's asked by philosophers. Yes, people who study logic mostly happen to be philosophers, but that doesn't mean that when they're doing logic, they're doing philosophy, right? Or they're asking truly philosophical questions. Okay. And then there's questions like this. So these are examples that Schwitzgebel gives. Did Kant ever write a certain sentence? I gave an example of a sentence. Did Kant ever write the sentence, free agency is a fundamental part of reality? Well, I'm pretty sure he didn't. But either way, it's pretty easy to find out. We've got all of his works. They're all digitized at this point. We can just search and see if he ever said this. Or we could say, did he ever make a claim that's equivalent to this? Where this might be a paraphrase of what he said. Well, that would take a little bit more work, but it's not something that requires speculation or conjecture. It just requires a lot of research, a lot of textual, study, close textual analysis, and that sort of thing. So the first question belongs to logic. This question belongs to the history of philosophy. The history of philosophy is a subfield of philosophy. I guess I didn't mention it, even though it's the subfield that I work on, because I'm trying to write a dissertation about Kant. And by the way, this is one of the claims I would like to believe Kant would agree with, even though he didn't directly say it. That's part of what I'm trying to argue. But anyway, if we're talking about this claim in quotation marks, that's certainly a philosophical claim. So is this claim true? Would be a philosophical question, and it certainly belongs to the penumbra. Whether free agency or free will is real at all, and whether it's fundamentally real, those are certainly philosophical questions, and they are certainly penumbral questions. But whether Kant thought that that's true, that's just a historical question. That's just did this individual philosopher in the past ever make a certain claim, right? And that's something we don't need. We're not thinking philosophically when we're trying to answer this question. We're thinking historically, right? Okay. But I think these are exceptions. It's hard to come up with these, and I think most questions asked by philosophers do belong to the penumbra. However, it's also worth noting that professional philosophers, people who are part of a philosophy department at an academic institution or publish articles in philosophy journals, these people are not the only people who ask and try to answer philosophical questions. So, philosophical questions are not the private property of professional philosophers. They don't have, complete you know, uh, dominion over these sorts of questions. And this is the point, one of the points that Schwitzgebel makes here in paragraph 17. He says, the penumbra is philosophy's familiar home, and any sufficiently broad question about the penumbra can be treated as a philosophical question. But these broad penumbral questions can be addressed not only by philosophers or people who think of themselves as philosophers, they can also be addressed by big picture speculative scientists, or by ambitious artists and cultural critics, or by professional philosophers. We need draw no sharp distinction. Okay, so he doesn't want to say that there are these people who are philosophers and then there are scientists and they're totally separate, uh, you know, activities, totally separate practices or pursuits. Sometimes people from both groups will ask similar questions, and sometimes those are philosophical questions. So he gives some examples. Theoretical physicists, together with philosophers of physics, can explore and debate interpretations of quantum mechanics. Theoretical psychologists and philosophers of psychology can debate the nature of mental representation. Novelists and philosophers can equally and collaboratively explore and debate what constitutes a life well lived, or how to find meaning in a vast, seemingly indifferent cosmos. So that's what we'll take up when we get to the meaning of life. And we'll look at some philosophers talking about that, and we'll look at some short stories that deal with that. Okay? So philosophical questions don't always belong in the penumbra, but they usually do. But even when they do, other people than professional philosophers can ask these questions and try to answer them. And maybe there's a sense in which all human beings, at least at some point in their lives, will ask philosophical questions, right? Okay. Another way of thinking about philosophers that's you might think demeaning, but if a philosopher is the one who's coming up with it, then I guess it's okay, right? Um, is to think of them as inquisitive children. So he has this idea of the toddler who is always asking questions. So let's look at what he says about that. So let's agree that philosophical questions are typically not straightforwardly answerable. And that's part of why it looks like we don't make any progress in philosophy. But if this is the case, is it really worthwhile to try to keep trying to answer them, right? Well, one might say that the questions demand answers whether we like it or not. So someone should probably try to answer them, however hard that might be. That's one response, right? On the contrary, one might suggest that simply ignoring these questions and sorry, one might suggest that we simply ignore these questions and focus on pragmatic or scientific ones. Well, that's fine too. But again, but that's sort of compatible with these are, compatible. It's like, yeah, some people can focus on pragmatic and scientific questions, but does that mean nobody is allowed to focus on the philosophical ones? So Schwitzgebel compares philosophers to inquisitive children who ask an endless series of questions because he wants to show us how easily we can find ourselves in the penumbra. That it doesn't take, a professional philosopher who's studied this stuff for many years and read all these texts and whatnot. Children and ordinary folks can quickly get into philosophical questions. And here's his example. My mug contains tea. That's in the circle of light, right? But then I can start reflecting. I can start contemplating and think, well, how do I know that? Well, by looking in the mug, I can tell, right? Oh, okay. But wait, how do I know that looking into a mug is a good way to learn about its contents? Well, now I'm already doing philosophy, right? Now we're doing epistemology, right? How does, visual perception uh, how is it a source of knowledge, right? Is it always a source of knowledge? Could it be an optical illusion? Could I be dreaming? And so on. But we can try to answer it like this. Well, okay, maybe the reason looking in a mug is a good way to learn about its contents is because looking in general with my eyes, visual perception, has seemed to be a reliable process in the past. But how do I know that? Well, because I remember it, but how do I know my memory is a reliable process? Oh, geez, right? And even if I do know that perception has been a reliable process in the past, why should we think that the past is a reliable guide to the future, right? Well, you think, well, what do you mean? I mean, there's regularities in nature and the way things used have typically happened, there's a good reason to believe that they'll continue happening that way. But why? Well, because they've always sort of continued in the same way. Right, but what if they suddenly change tomorrow? Right? There's all the sorts of puzzles we can get ourselves into here. So starting anywhere with whether my mug contains tea, we can quickly find layers of philosophical depth. Now, these might not be particularly compelling or gripping philosophical questions, but he's, just using this as an illustration to show that just by asking some follow-up questions to an original statement that's not philosophical, we quickly get to philosophical things. Okay, well, I said that I will talk about skepticism in case you're the kind of person who is sort of skeptical about philosophy and you think, yeah, this is a waste of time. Nobody's ever made progress. So let's look at that. So I think most philosophers throughout history have tried to answer the major penumbral questions. There has also been a perennial countercurrent known as philosophical skepticism. So, skepticism is an ordinary word that means, being doubtful of something, right? In philosophy, it has sort of a more specific use, but it basically means the same thing um, as it ordinarily does. So, skeptics are philosophers who think that many, if not all, of the questions of philosophy are just unanswerable. And the only thing we can claim to know is that we don't know and probably can't know the answers. Okay. And this is an idea that goes back to Socrates, the teacher of Plato. So I've told you about, I started with Plato. Aristotle, I mentioned, he was a famous student of Plato's, and Socrates was the teacher of Plato. So they're sort of the big three figures in ancient Greek philosophy. Anyway, Socrates is known for lots of things, but uh, this idea that the only thing we can know is that we don't know certain things, that's what is often called Socratic ignorance. Okay, he claimed to be ignorant about the answers to the big questions. He was mostly interested in ethical questions, questions about human life and how we should live our lives. And he thought, look, nobody really knows the answer to what is the best way to live a human life, which he thought of as the main question of ethics, right? How should we live our lives? He thinks nobody knows the answer to that, but the problem is a lot of people think they do, and they're wrong about that. Whereas I, Socrates, I don't think I know the answer. I'm not under that illusion. I know that I don't know. And so that's what he thinks gave him an advantage over most people. This is also connected with the Socratic method of teaching by asking questions of the student rather than simply stating truths. Okay. Well, it's a little bit different. The way it's used nowadays, the Socratic method usually means asking the student questions until they come up with the right answer. When Socrates used this method, it was more sort of negative, and he would ask people questions to show that they didn't know what they thought they knew, that they were as ignorant as he is, but they didn't realize it. Here's a famous quotation from Plato's Apology. This is so Socrates didn't write anything. He was just a public figure in Athens and just had conversations with all sorts of people. And he was at some point accused of corrupting the youth and undermining traditional religion. And at his trial, he gave a long speech defending himself. And Plato wrote a dialogue called the Apology. Apology, by the way, means a defense speech. It doesn't mean because Socrates was definitely not apologetic. He wasn't saying, I'm sorry for what I've done. He's saying, I didn't do the things you're accusing me of. And furthermore, you should be, praising me and seeing how valuable of a person I am, rather than, sentencing me to death. And of course, they sentenced him to death. Here's what he said. He was talking about various types of people that he interacted with, poets, politicians, craftspeople, and he thought, you know what? I don't know much, but I know that I'm wiser than these people. Why? He says, I'm wiser than these people, for neither of us appears to know anything fine and good, but they think they know something, although they know nothing. Whereas I, as I do not know anything, also, I do not think that I know anything, right? Okay. So anyway, that's a sort of skeptical attitude because it's saying, it's denying the possibility of knowledge. Well, maybe Socrates wasn't denying the possibility of knowledge. He was denying the actuality of knowledge. He doesn't think anybody actually currently has answers to these philosophical questions, but he was certainly searching for answers. He wasn't giving up. He was open to the possibility that we could come up with answers, but I think the first step in his mind was realizing that we don't have the answers yet and we're not anywhere close to having them. So we've got to be skeptical first before we can do serious philosophy. Okay. Schwitzgebel doesn't mention Socrates, but he mentions another philosopher, Agrippa, from the first century of the Common Era, who is a Roman philosopher, and he was part of the tradition known as academic skepticism, which derived from Plato's Academy in ancient Greece. Although Plato wasn't particularly skeptical, his followers tended to be. Anyway, Agrippa posed the following trilemma. A trilemma is a dilemma, except with three horns instead of two. We often call the two options in a dilemma the horns of the dilemma. I guess like the horns of a bull or something. Anyway, a dilemma is a situation where one has two options to choose among, but neither are desirable, and a trilemma is one where there are three options to choose among, but none are desirable. Okay, so what is the trilemma? So let's say we're trying to prove something. Let's say we're trying to argue for a certain claim. Let's call that claim A. To establish some proposition A, if we aren't just going to assume it without argument, that's one option. We could just dogmatically declare something to be true. But if we want to establish it convincingly, we need an argument. Well, an argument has to have at least one premise. So if A is going to be the conclusion, let's say that B is the premise that we're going to support A with, right? But then how do we establish B? Well, we're going to need a further argument with at least one premise, C, and so on. You get the idea, right? And so why is this a trilemma? Well, here are the three options when we're faced with this realization that in order to establish any proposition, it starts to look like we're going to have to do this forever, right? Infinitely justify our justifications, support our support, our support, and so on, right? So either option one, we simply stop dogmatically somewhere, just assuming that A is true without further argument. Or maybe we assume that B is true without further argument. Or maybe we go all the way back to C, but then we stop there. But the idea of stopping somewhere and not continuing to try to support our sort of most basic premise, that's one option. Option two is that we argue in a circle, eventually coming back to A. So we support A with B, we support B with C, but if we support C with A again, we've just reasoned in a circle and we haven't really established anything, right? Because A is true only if B is true, B is true only if C is true, but C is true only if A is true, but we're trying to figure out if A is true. So everything is ungrounded then. So a circular reasoning is a fallacy, right? Or we regress infinitely so that there's always a new question to pursue without end. So if we think that if we are willing to say, yeah, we can we're never going to reach the sort of fundamental principle that we can derive everything from. It goes on forever, and we can never finish. So I'm not saying that all of these are equally bad options, but it's still a trilemma in the sense that it's like, maybe we were hoping for something better, like a self-evident first principle that doesn't need to be justified. Everybody can see that it's true, and then from that, everything else follows. That's sort of like the philosopher's dream in a way, or at least a certain kind of philosopher. This idea of looking for a first principle that justifies everything else is sometimes called foundationalism in epistemology. The idea that there's a foundation that we can know with certainty, like Descartes' uh, claim that he exists, and then he thinks he can derive everything else from that, right? So, but somebody else might say, well, you're still stopping dogmatically. You're assuming that that foundation really is self-evident, but what if somebody doesn't think it's self-evident, right? So that's one option. Or here, I'll discuss the options down here. Um, so yeah, this is also related to the passage I discussed from Kant's Critique of Pure Reason in Lecture 1.1, where he describes the peculiar fate of reason. But I'll comment on that in a second. The idea is something like this. Our power of reason demands answers to certain questions, like these penumbral questions of philosophy. But reason cannot be satisfied with mere dogmas. Reason always wants to know the reason or know the justification for something. It doesn't just want to accept it on faith or accept it as just a brute fact. It wants to know why. So that's why we ask these questions, right? Mystery and reason. Um, we can't be satisfied with circular reasoning because then nothing is really supported. And we maybe can't be satisfied with an infinite regress either. So an infinite regress is where we're regressing to further and further premises, going back, back, back. But where does it end? If it doesn't end anywhere, then what's happening? Like then it's kind of like circular reasoning in the sense that instead of saying back, let me say down, because the idea is can we find a foundation? Well, if it just keeps going down and there's no bottom level of certainty, then it also sort of seems like the whole structure is unfounded, right? So this is a problem. And you might think that it's a problem for philosophy, but honestly, it's a problem for all forms of knowledge in a way. I guess the only way out of this situation, or one of the only ways out of it, is just to say, well, oh well, too bad. Yeah, I guess that's how things are, but we're just gonna, do our best and not think about that problem, right? And that's probably what most people do. Let me remind you about the passage from Kant. So one of my favorite sentences in all of philosophy is the first sentence of the Critique of Pure Reason, where he says, "Human reason has the peculiar fate in one species of its cognitions, that it is burdened with questions which it cannot dismiss, since they are given to it as problems by the nature of reason itself, but which it also cannot answer, since they transcend every capacity of human reason." Okay, so that's Kant's version of this. And if you look at what he says in the following paragraphs, he gets into a lot of the same things as Agrippa is talking about, or this is Schwitzgebel talking about Agrippa. But anyway, let's get to the positive stuff. So I said, yeah, you can be skeptical, but let's see how sort of optimistic we can be if we choose to be. So in response to this trilemma, what Schwitzgebel does is draw a distinction between two opposing approaches to philosophy. He says philosophy can either aim to open or to close. So it's kind of another metaphor that he's using here. Suppose you enter philosophical topic X, imagining three viable, mutually exclusive possibilities, rivals, right? A, B, and C. The philosophy of closing aims to reduce three to one. And that's what we've been doing in our critical thinking. We've got a bunch of rivals. We're trying to see if we can get enough information so that there's one clear rival that's clearly at the top of the ranking, right? So this way of thinking aims to convince you that A is correct and the others are wrong. If it succeeds, then you know the truth about topic X, namely A is the answer. Okay, well, hopefully you can tell in the way he's describing this that it's a little bit naive and simplistic. The philosophy of closing, that's what he calls this, fails to distinguish, it seems, between the circle of light and the penumbra, and it wrongly assumes that philosophical questions belong to the circle of light, because that would make them straightforwardly answerable, so that we could say, here it is, A, that's the answer to the question, not B and not C. We've got it. We've finished. We're done, right? By contrast, he's going to suggest we consider the philosophy of opening, which aims to add new possibilities into your thinking, possibilities that you hadn't considered before, or that you had considered but too quickly dismissed. We can learn that the range of viable possibilities is broader than we had assumed. So we do this also in critical thinking when we're coming up with rivals. The author gives us their conclusion as if they've got the answer, and we say, hold on, couldn't it also be this or this or this? Right? So we've been doing both of these in a way. Now he wants to defend the philosophy of opening. So he argues that given the fact that philosophy lives in the penumbra, opening is a more appropriate approach than closing. Here's how he says that. For me, the greatest philosophical thrill, and this is ultimately, sort of first personal and subjective. Maybe not everybody gets this thrill, but let's go along with him. Okay, the greatest philosophical thrill is realizing that something I had long taken for granted might not be true, that some obvious apparent truth is in fact doubtable, not just abstractly and hypothetically doubtable, but really seriously in my gut doubtable. The ground shifts beneath me. Where I had thought there would be a floor, there is instead open space I hadn't previously seen. My mind spins in new, unfamiliar directions. I wonder, and the wonder itself seems to glow with a new wondrousness. The cosmos expands, bigger with possibility, more complex, more unfathomable. I feel small and confused, but in a good way. With each new or I add, the idea being there's A or there's B or there's C, all these different possible answers, which with each new one that I add, my epistemic world widens. Okay, so if you're the kind of person who likes security, who likes things to be clear cut, and who doesn't like being surprised, who doesn't like, you know, being confused, then yeah, maybe philosophy is not thrilling for you. Maybe it's unsettling and you'd rather avoid it. Okay. I would like to think that if you're an artist, you have some sense of this, but in a different sort of context, right? That art also has the power to shift the ground beneath us, to make us see things in a new and surprising way, to make us uncomfortable and not just say, oh, yeah, that's the thing that I always love to see. I mean, some artists, play it safe and just paint, pretty landscapes, and there's nothing wrong with that. But there's a way of doing art that's more subversive and challenging, and it shows, maybe ugly things, but in a way that has its own sort of beauty, right? So I think there's an interesting analogies here between philosophy and art. He doesn't really explore those. He mentions art a few times, but I think a lot of the stuff he says about philosophy can be applied to art as well. Maybe we'll get to that if we talk about aesthetics later in the semester. Anyway, let's keep going. So he then connects these ideas back to the original question of progress in philosophy. He says closure and convergence, the idea of converging upon a single answer to a philosophical question, he thinks these are not or should not be the primary aim of philosophy or the mark of philosophical progress. It's also progress. So here he's challenging an assumption that the critic who says that philosophy doesn't make progress, they are assuming that progress has to look one way. He's giving us another way of looking at it. He says it's also progress to create doubt where none existed before, if that doubt appropriately reflects our newly recognized ignorance. And you can see the connection with Socrates and skepticism here. It is progress to appreciate possibilities we hadn't previously grasped. It is progress to chart previously unthought landscapes of what might be so. To ask only questions we can answer would be a sad failure of imagination. So again, if as an artist you value the imagination, uh, then maybe you can see how unimaginative it is to think that philosophy should be converging towards single, simple, clear-cut answers. It's much more expansive, it's much more interesting, it's much more liberating to open the range of possibilities, to doubt things that we think of as, that we take for granted, right? So in a way, he Schwitzgebel is using the idea of skepticism and doubt as not as like a way of shutting down philosophical questioning, but a way of opening it up, right? By doubting, we actually we free ourselves from a single way of thinking that we already have latched onto, and we look at what else could be true. Now, at this point, I think what I'll do is split this into two lectures. This is longer than I thought it would be. So we'll get into the question of the value of philosophy in in the next installment. Okay, so I will resume with this article then. All right. See ya.